Oklahoma just told the entire world that Chinese companies cannot own farmland in their state. They passed law after law after law, 3 pieces of legislation in 3 years: Senate Bill 212, Senate Bill 1705, House Bill 1546, each one tougher than the last. The message was crystal clear. If you have ties to China, to Russia, to Iran, to North Korea, you're not buying an inch of Oklahoma dirt, period. And then they carved out an exception for the one Chinese-owned company that actually owns farmland in Oklahoma. I want you to sit with that for a second, because this is not some conspiracy theory. This is not some rumor floating around on the internet. This is published, documented, verified law. Oklahoma lawmakers wrote legislation that banned foreign adversaries from owning agricultural land, and then they wrote a loophole that specifically protects Smithfield Foods, the largest pork producer in the United States, owned by WH Group, headquartered in Hong Kong, a Chinese company running hog operations on roughly 2,475 acres in the Oklahoma Panhandle. Still there, still operating, legally protected. And between 2024 and 2025, Smithfield spent at least $158 million on lobbying and more than $90,000 in political contributions during the 2024 election cycle. Those are not my numbers. Those come directly from investigative reporting by Investigate Midwest, published December 2025. Now, here is what makes this so much bigger than one company in one state. Because what is happening in Oklahoma is not an isolated incident. It is part of a national earthquake that is reshaping who can own land in America, who cannot, and who gets to play by different rules. Right now, over 2/3 of U.S. states have either enacted or considered laws limiting foreign ownership of farmland. Texas signed one of the most aggressive bans in the country in June 2025. California passed a unanimous ban through both chambers of their legislature, and the governor vetoed it. Florida is fighting a legal battle in federal court. Arkansas forced a Chinese-owned agricultural giant to sell its land entirely. And sitting right in the middle of all of this is a question that nobody in mainstream media is willing to ask out loud. If this is really about national security, why does the biggest Chinese agricultural operation in the heartland get a free pass? In this video, I'm going to walk you through the entire story, the real numbers, the actual laws, the exemptions nobody is talking about, and the massive shift happening right now in China that is making all of this 10 times more urgent than it was even a year ago. No hype, no fear-mongering, just the facts laid out so you can make your own decisions about what this means for your property, your food supply, and your future. Because the more I dug into this, the more I realized that the story everyone thinks they know about China buying American farmland is almost completely wrong. The real story is stranger, more complicated, and honestly, more important than anything the cable news cycle has given you. And it starts not on a farm in Texas, but in a half-empty apartment tower in a third-tier Chinese city that nobody in America has ever heard of. Let us get into it. Before we talk about what is happening on American soil, we need to understand what is happening on Chinese soil. Because the two stories are connected in ways that most people do not realize. China's housing market is not just struggling, it is going through the most significant structural adjustment in its modern history. And the numbers tell a story that is genuinely hard to wrap your head around. According to the eHouse China Research and Development Institute, a Shanghai-based think tank that tracks housing data across 100 major Chinese cities, the average time needed to sell all existing new home inventory hit 27.4 months in November 2025. To put that in perspective, 14 months is widely regarded as the upper limit of a balanced, healthy housing market. They are nearly double that. And it gets worse when you break it down by city tier. First-tier cities like Beijing and Shanghai averaged about 17 months. Second-tier cities were running 22.6 months. But third and fourth-tier cities, the places where the infamous ghost cities were built, are looking at substantially longer timelines that make 27 months look generous. This is why the Chinese government has officially made inventory reduction the central policy mandate for 2026. This is not my characterization. This is how Chinese authorities themselves describe it. At their National Housing Conference in late December 2025, Minister for Housing and Urban-Rural Development Ni Hong announced a targeted, city-by-city approach to manage new housing supply and reduce existing inventory. Think about what that means. The second largest economy on the planet is directing its housing apparatus to figure out how to get rid of homes that nobody wants to buy. And they are deploying serious capital to do it. The People's Bank of China established a 300 billion yuan relending facility, roughly $43 billion, specifically for affordable housing conversion. They are literally taking unsold commercial properties and converting them into government-subsidized housing just to clear the books. Now here is where it connects to our story. When you have a real estate market that is deflating this aggressively, capital does not just sit still. It moves. And for decades, real estate was the primary vehicle for Chinese wealth preservation. With stringent capital controls limiting overseas investment options, property was how Chinese families built and stored their savings. That engine is now broken. The Communist Party's own flagship journal, Kyushi, published a commentary in January 2026 that explicitly stated the conventional real estate development model has reached its limits. That is an extraordinary admission from a publication directly overseen by the Central Committee. They are not hiding it anymore. The China Index Academy reported that in the first 11 months of 2025, the average price of second-hand residential properties across 100 major cities fell by a cumulative 7.46%. This is a market where prices are dropping, inventory is piling up, developers are carrying dangerous levels of debt, and the government is openly saying some companies will probably go bankrupt. So when we see legislative action across the United States targeting foreign, and specifically Chinese, ownership of American land, it is not happening in a vacuum. It is happening against the backdrop of the largest real estate correction in modern Chinese history. And there is a human dimension to this that the numbers do not capture. For decades, the Chinese middle class poured their life savings into apartments. Real estate was not just an investment, it was the retirement plan. It was the wedding dowry. It was the proof that you had made it. And now millions of families are watching that value evaporate. Developers like Evergrande, once the biggest in the country, collapsed under more than $300 billion of debt. Hundreds of thousands of pre-sold homes were left unfinished. Entire communities that were supposed to house wealthy families have been reclaimed by local farmers who now grow crops between empty mansions. The psychological shock of watching your primary store of wealth lose value year after year cannot be overstated. And it is creating enormous pressure on Chinese capital to find new places to park. Whether that capital is flowing into American farmland in any significant quantity is actually debatable. But the political perception that it is, or that it could, is driving legislation across the country. But here's the thing that most coverage gets wrong. The actual scale of Chinese-owned farmland in America is tiny. This is where most content creators lose credibility, and I refuse to do that to you. So let us talk about the real numbers. According to the United States Department of Agriculture's land report, Chinese investors own approximately 383,000 total acres of U.S. farmland. That sounds like a lot until you realize it is about 600 square miles, which is less than 1% of all foreign-held acreage in the United States. Less than 1%. Let that sink in. The legislative firestorm sweeping through state houses from Austin to Oklahoma City to Tallahassee is being driven by concerns over a land position that represents a fraction of America's total agricultural footprint. Canadian and European companies own vastly more American farmland than any Chinese entity. In Oklahoma specifically, approximately 4.3% of farmland is foreign-owned according to the USDA's most recent filings. But most of that is held by Canadian and European companies, primarily for renewable energy projects like wind farms. The Chinese share, less than 1% of that 4.3%. So why is this such a massive political issue? 3 reasons. First, proximity to military installations. There was a genuine national security concern when a Chinese firm attempted to buy land near a U.S. military air base in Texas for a wind farm project. Federal officials reviewed the transaction, and even though they determined it would not pose a direct security threat, the firm ultimately had to sell its interest to a Spanish company. That incident became the catalyst for Texas and other states to act preemptively. Second, the Smithfield precedent. When WH Group acquired Smithfield Foods in 2013 for $4.7 billion, it was one of the largest Chinese acquisitions of an American company ever. The U.S. Senate investigated. CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, reviewed it and ultimately approved the deal. But the fact that a Chinese company now controls the largest pork producer in the country, with operations across multiple states, has never sat well with certain lawmakers. Smithfield itself says it owns approximately 85,000 acres of U.S. farmland, which it points out represents less than 1/100th of 1% of all American farmland. Third, and this is the real driver, political incentive. A recent poll showed that Republicans nationwide are deeply concerned about Chinese ownership of U.S. farmland. According to the National Agriculture Law Center, by 2024, more than 2/3 of states had enacted or considered laws limiting foreign land ownership. This is a bipartisan energy source. Left-leaning lawmakers worry about food security and water rights. Right-leaning lawmakers frame it as national defense. The numbers are small, the political energy is enormous, and the legislation that has resulted from this collision is creating a patchwork of contradictions that you need to understand. Here's a useful way to think about it. Imagine you own a house and you find out that 0.04% of the houses in your neighborhood were purchased by someone from a country your government considers an adversary. That is the actual proportion we are talking about nationally. Now imagine your neighborhood association responds by passing sweeping new rules about who can and cannot buy houses, rules that affect every buyer and seller, that face constitutional challenges, and that exempt the one foreign owner who was already there. That is essentially what is happening at the state level across America. I am not saying the concerns are baseless. The national security angle around military installations is legitimate. The opacity of foreign investment flows is a genuine problem. But the gap between the scale of the actual issue and the scale of the legislative response tells you that this is being driven by something more than pure security calculus. Politics, perception, and election cycles are doing the heavy lifting here. Because not all bans are created equal, and some of them have doors built right into their walls. In June 2025, Governor Greg Abbott signed Senate Bill 17 into law. Its author, Republican Senator Lois Kolkhorst, called it the strongest national security bill of any state passed. And to be fair, it is aggressive. SB 17 prohibits people, companies, and government-linked entities connected to China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia from acquiring most types of real estate in Texas. Not just farmland. Most real estate, homes, commercial property, agricultural land. If you have ties to those four nations and you are not a U.S. citizen or green card holder, you are locked out. But it went further. During the House debate, an amendment was passed that gave the governor unilateral authority to add more countries to the ban list. That amendment passed 85 to 60. It means the governor can, without legislative approval, decide that citizens from additional countries should be restricted from buying property in Texas. That is an extraordinary concentration of power in one office. Democratic State Representative Gene Wu raised the alarm during floor debate. His concern was blunt. Giving one person the power to decide which nationalities can own property in Texas without oversight is dangerous. And civil rights groups echoed those concerns, pointing out that this echoes the alien land laws of the early 20th century that banned Chinese and Japanese immigrants from owning property. Asian Texans for Justice, an advocacy group that formed specifically in response to this legislation, has argued that SB 17 revives a shameful chapter in American history. And they are not just making a philosophical argument, they are making a practical one. What happens when a real estate agent or a title company has to determine whether a buyer has ties to a restricted nation? The bill gives the Attorney General enforcement authority, but does not specify what would trigger an investigation. Here is where it gets legally complicated. A federal judge dismissed a constitutional challenge to SB 17 before it took effect in September 2025. But the plaintiffs, two Chinese nationals living in Texas, immediately appealed to the Fifth Circuit. The case is still alive, and similar laws in Florida and Arkansas have faced their own legal challenges, with federal judges blocking enforcement in some cases. The underlying tension is real. States believe they have the authority to restrict foreign property ownership for national security reasons. Civil rights advocates argue that these laws target people based on national origin, which runs headfirst into the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause and the Fair Housing Act. This legal uncertainty matters for anyone watching the land market in these states. Because until the courts definitively resolve whether these laws are constitutional, you are looking at a regulatory environment that could change overnight. A buyer, a seller, a developer in Texas right now is operating under rules that might be struck down next month or upheld for a generation. Texas built the strongest wall, but that wall is standing on legal ground that is still shifting underneath it. And here is something else worth considering. The law took effect September 1st, 2025, which means that any transaction that happened before that date is grandfathered in. The clock started, but only going forward. So whatever foreign-owned land existed in Texas before that date stays in foreign hands. The law does not claw anything back. It only prevents new acquisitions. This is a critical distinction that most coverage glosses over. The existing foreign ownership footprint in Texas was locked in place the day before the law took effect. There is also the enforcement question. The bill gives the Attorney General the authority to develop a system for investigating potential violations. But it does not spell out what triggers an investigation. It does not create a proactive audit mechanism. It does not fund a new enforcement division. It creates a prohibition and then essentially says, we will figure out how to enforce it later. If you have ever watched how government enforcement works in practice, you know that unfunded mandates tend to produce uneven results. If Texas represents the bold headline, Oklahoma represents the fine print. And the fine print is where the real story lives. Oklahoma's approach did not happen overnight. It was a 3-year legislative blitz that unfolded in stages. In 2023, Senate Bill 212 expanded existing restrictions on foreign ownership of farmland. The initial framing was not even about China specifically. It was positioned as a tool to combat illegal marijuana grow operations linked to foreign cartels. After Oklahoma legalized medical marijuana in 2018, the state saw an influx of out-of-state growers, and there were reports of labor exploitation and illegally operated farms. But the real targets became clear fast. In May 2024, Governor Kevin Stitt signed Senate Bill 1705, which explicitly named foreign government adversaries, including China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Then, in November 2025, House Bill 1546 went into effect, closing strawman loopholes and restricting foreign principals from acquiring property within 200 miles of military installations or critical infrastructure. 3 laws, each one tighter, each one more specific. And through all 3 of them, Smithfield Foods remained untouched. Here's exactly how they did it. The CFIUS exception. Oklahoma's foreign ownership restrictions do not apply to foreign companies that have an agreement with the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. CFIUS is a federal interagency committee that reviews foreign investments in American companies and real estate to determine if they pose national security risks. WH Group's 2013 acquisition of Smithfield was cleared by CFIUS. That federal approval became Smithfield's shield. Oklahoma State Senator, defending the exception, framed it as constitutional compliance. The argument is straightforward. If the federal government has already vetted a foreign investment and given it the green light, the state should honor that determination. On paper, that is a defensible position. In practice, it creates a 2-tier system of land ownership. Tier 1 includes new foreign entities trying to buy land. They are blocked, done, no entry. Tier 2 includes established foreign entities that already have federal approval. They are grandfathered in. Their operations continue. Their land stays. And here is the contrast that makes this story impossible to ignore. In neighboring Arkansas, Syngenta, owned by the Chinese state-owned ChemChina, was forced to divest its land holdings in 2023. Same region. Same type of foreign ownership concerns, completely different outcome. Syngenta lost its land. Smithfield kept its land. The difference? Smithfield had CFIUS approval and a $158 million lobbying operation. The Oklahoma Attorney General has said his office currently has 150 pending cases involving illegal marijuana farms. But during a September hearing at the state capitol about the perceived threat of the Chinese Communist Party, Smithfield was conspicuously absent from the discussion. The only Chinese-owned company actually farming thousands of acres in the state was not mentioned. Not once. That is not an accident. That is architecture. And it raises a question that I think is worth sitting with. Is the goal of these laws to prevent foreign adversaries from owning American farmland? Or is the goal to look like you are preventing it while protecting established economic relationships? Because if Smithfield's 2,475 acres in Oklahoma do not represent a national security concern, then what exactly is the security threshold? If 85,000 acres of total Smithfield farmland across the country is fine because CFIUS approved it in 2013, then what has changed between 2013 and now that makes new foreign acquisitions dangerous but existing ones safe? The answer, if we are being honest, is that the political environment changed, not the security calculus. Politicians needed to respond to constituent anxiety about Chinese influence. Passing a ban was the response. But forcing divestiture of an existing major employer, a company that supports jobs and supply chains across the panhandle, that would have been economically painful. So they drew a line that excluded the biggest player. Clean headline, messy reality. Smithfield, for its part, has pushed back against characterizations that it represents Chinese infiltration of the U.S. food supply. The company emphasizes that it is managed by American executives and that its farmland represents less than 1/100th of 1% of all American farmland. Their spokesperson has made the point directly. This is not a national security risk. And in purely numerical terms, that argument has weight. But the political symbolism of a Chinese-owned company operating thousands of acres while the state passes anti-Chinese ownership laws is impossible to ignore. And then there is California, where the politics of land ownership took a turn that, depending on your perspective, was either pragmatic governance or complete betrayal. In September 2022, both chambers of the California State Legislature passed Senate Bill 1084, the Food and Farm Security Act. The vote was not close. It passed the Assembly 75-0 and the Senate 37-0, unanimous. Every single legislator who voted said yes, Democrats and Republicans, urban and rural districts, everyone agreed. The bill, authored by Democratic Senator Melissa Hurtado, would have prohibited foreign governments and state-controlled enterprises from purchasing, acquiring, leasing, or holding an interest in agricultural land in California. It would have also required the California Department of Food and Agriculture to compile annual reports on foreign ownership of farmland, water rights, desalination facilities, and energy infrastructure. Given that foreign investors own over 1.1 million acres of California agricultural land, and given that California produces roughly half of all U.S. grown fruits, nuts, and vegetables, the stakes were not theoretical. Senator Hurtado put it plainly: food can be used as a weapon. If foreign actors gain control of California's land and water, we could see food shortages, water profiteering, and higher prices at the grocery store. Governor Gavin Newsom vetoed it. His reasoning was bureaucratic. He argued that the data reporting requirements would create arduous new responsibilities for CDFA. He pointed out that federal law under FIDA, the Agricultural Foreign Investment Disclosure Act, already requires foreign governments to report their farmland interests to the USDA. He essentially said the bill was redundant and administratively burdensome. The reaction was furious. Supporters of the bill pointed out that AFIDA's data is widely regarded as incomplete and unreliable. The Center for Strategic and International Studies has described AFIDA's reports as incomplete and riddled with errors, noting that the system is entirely reliant on self-reporting, and the USDA does not check it for completeness or accuracy. So the existing federal framework that Newsom pointed to as sufficient was, by the assessment of nonpartisan security researchers, not sufficient at all. Hurtado tried again. She reworked the bill, changed the responsible agency from CDFA to the Governor's Office of Emergency Services, and pushed a new version. Meanwhile, Arizona's Democratic governor also vetoed a similar bill that would have prevented Chinese entities from buying land near military bases. The pattern is striking. Conservative states are passing aggressive bans with loopholes. Progressive states are blocking bans entirely with bureaucratic justifications. And in neither case is the underlying question being answered: who actually owns America's agricultural land, and what are they doing with it? Because here is the uncomfortable truth. The USDA's tracking system is built on an honor system. Foreign owners self-report. Nobody verifies. The last enforcement fine was in 2014, and in the years since, foreign-held agricultural acreage has grown from 26 million acres to over 40 million acres. We do not have a reliable map of who owns what. And the political system is fighting over restrictions while lacking the basic data infrastructure to enforce them. Think about that for a moment. We are in a situation where lawmakers in Texas are willing to give the governor unilateral power to ban entire nationalities from buying property, while in California, the governor will not even sign a bill that creates a reporting mechanism to track who already owns what. Oklahoma is willing to pass 3 separate laws restricting foreign ownership, while keeping the one Chinese company that owns land completely exempt. And the federal system that is supposed to be tracking all of this has not issued a fine in over a decade. This is not a system that is working. This is a system that is performing. It is performing security. It is performing protectionism. It is performing concern. But underneath the performance, the actual infrastructure of land ownership transparency in America is surprisingly thin, and that should concern everyone, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, because you cannot protect what you refuse to measure. And right now, America is arguing about who should not be allowed to buy land while simultaneously refusing to build a reliable system for tracking who already has. So where does this leave us? You have watched states across the country draw lines in the sand. You have seen those lines bend for well-connected companies. You have seen governors block unanimous legislation. And behind all of it, you have the second largest economy in the world actively managing the largest housing correction in its modern history. Let me break down what this means in practical, actionable terms. Because this is not just a political story, this is a market story. And the market is sending signals. Signal 1. The regulatory environment for foreign land ownership is becoming more restrictive, but unevenly. As of now, roughly 21 states have specific laws restricting foreign entities from acquiring agricultural land. But each state has taken its own approach. Some ban outright. Some restrict based on acreage. Some target specific nationalities. Some require divestiture. Some grandfather in existing ownership. There is no uniform federal standard. This fragmentation means that land in one state may face completely different foreign investment dynamics than land 50 miles across a state border. Signal 2. The legal challenges are not going away. The Texas case is at the 5th Circuit. The Florida case is pending appeal at the 11th Circuit. A federal judge in Arkansas granted a preliminary injunction blocking a similar law. The constitutional questions, equal protection, Fair Housing Act preemption, federal versus state authority, are going to be litigated for years. Any investment thesis that assumes these bans are permanent and settled is built on sand. Signal 3. The CFIUS exception creates a permanent class of protected foreign agricultural operations. This is the most underreported dimension of this entire story. The Oklahoma model, ban new foreign acquisitions but protect existing CFIUS-approved operations, is likely to become the template other states follow. It is legally defensible. It does not force politically painful divestiture. And It allows lawmakers to claim they banned foreign ownership while the largest foreign agricultural operation in their state continues business as usual. Signal 4. The data problem is the real vulnerability. Without reliable tracking of who owns agricultural land in America, enforcement of any ban is limited. Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma introduced the Soil Act of 2025, calling for mandatory CFIS review of foreign agricultural land purchases. Oklahoma Representative Frank Lucas introduced the Agricultural Risk Review Act of 2025, which would make the Secretary of Agriculture a permanent member of CFIS. These federal proposals acknowledge what the state-level bans cannot solve alone. You cannot protect what you cannot see. Signal 5. Agricultural land as an asset class is being repriced by politics, not just economics. When you add legal uncertainty, foreign buyer restrictions, and national security designations to the traditional fundamentals of farmland valuation, you get a market that behaves differently than it did 5 years ago. Some buyers will see restricted markets as safer because foreign competition is reduced. Others will see legal risk and stay away. The net effect is harder to predict than either side wants to admit. The honest answer is that nobody knows exactly how this plays out. What we do know is that the current trajectory is toward more restriction, more litigation, more exemptions, and more contradiction. And the people making decisions about land right now are doing so with incomplete information in a regulatory environment that is actively shifting. If you are a domestic buyer looking at agricultural property in states with foreign ownership bans, you might see reduced competition for certain parcels. But you are also inheriting the legal and political uncertainty that comes with buying in a market shaped by laws that could be struck down. If you are a seller, you might face a smaller buyer pool if your property is in a restricted state. And if you're watching from the sidelines, trying to decide when and where to make a move, you are dealing with a level of regulatory complexity that did not exist 3 years ago. The bottom line is this: land in America is being repriced by politics. Whether that repricing works in your favor or against it depends entirely on which state you are in, which laws survive judicial review, and whether the enforcement mechanisms actually function. None of those questions have been answered yet. I want to leave you with something that I think ties this entire story together. Because if you have watched this far, you understand that this is not really about China. And it is not really about Oklahoma or Texas or California. It is about a question that every generation of Americans has had to answer. Who gets to own the land? It is the oldest question in the American experiment. It was asked when the colonies were established. It was asked during westward expansion. It was asked when the Homestead Act opened up the plains. It was asked when Japanese-American families had their property confiscated during World War II. And it is being asked right now in state capitals across the country as lawmakers try to figure out how to navigate a world where capital is global but land is local. The National Agricultural Law Center has documented that foreign ownership debates in American history trace all the way back to the colonial period and the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The first wave of alien land laws hit in the late 1800s and early 1900s, targeting Japanese and Chinese immigrants specifically. California had one, Texas had one, a dozen states had them. They were eventually struck down or repealed as the country recognized them for what they were: codified discrimination dressed up as security. Today, we are in a new cycle of that same conversation. The threats are different, the geopolitics are different, the scale of global capital flows is different. But the fundamental tension is identical. How do you protect national interests without creating laws that discriminate based on where someone was born? Representative Jean Wu, arguing against SB 17 on the Texas House floor, made this point directly. 100 years ago, when Texas passed similar laws, they did not list out Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans by name. They simply said, people who are ineligible for citizenship, because at that time, federal law banned only two groups from becoming citizens: Chinese people and Japanese people. The mechanism was different. The effect was the same. Now, I am not here to tell you what side of this debate to land on. There are legitimate national security concerns. The proximity of some foreign-owned land to military installations is real. The opacity of foreign investment flows through shell companies and layered corporate structures is real. The fact that the USDA's tracking system is broken is real. These are not manufactured worries. They deserve serious policy responses. But it is also real that less than 1% of foreign-held farmland in America is Chinese-owned. It is also real that the biggest Chinese agricultural operation in Oklahoma is legally protected while lawmakers grandstand about banning Chinese ownership. It is also real that unanimous bipartisan legislation got vetoed because of reporting requirements. And it is also real that domestic corporations, private equity firms, and billionaire investors own vastly more American farmland than any foreign government, and nobody is writing laws about that. The story that the media wants to tell you is simple. China bad, ban good, problem solved. The actual story is messy, contradictory, and full of exemptions that benefit whoever has the best lobbyists. And here's the part that concerns me most. None of this is going to slow down. China's housing market correction is going to continue. The political incentive to pass foreign land bans is going to intensify heading into 2026 midterms. The legal challenges are going to multiply. And the Smithfield-sized loopholes are going to keep getting carved out behind closed doors. If you own property with land, if you're thinking about buying property with land, or if you just care about understanding who actually controls the ground beneath your feet, you need to pay attention to this. Not to the headlines, to the fine print. Because in America, the laws are always written twice. Once for the public, and once for the people who can afford a $1.58 million lobbying budget. That is not cynicism. That is what the public record shows. And the public record is the only thing I'm interested in giving you. Not hype, not fear. Not some manufactured crisis designed to make you click. Just the documented, sourced, verifiable truth about who owns the ground beneath your feet and who gets to decide that going forward. This is one of those stories that is going to keep evolving. The court cases have not been decided. The Fifth Circuit could uphold the Texas ban or strike it down. The 11th Circuit is still weighing Florida's version. The 2026 midterms are going to pour gasoline on every one of these legislative battles because foreign land ownership is the kind of issue that polls well and generates attack ads. China's housing correction is not going to reverse overnight. And every month that inventory numbers stay elevated, the narrative about fleeing Chinese capital gains more traction whether the data supports it or not. And the Smithfield exemption is going to face more scrutiny as investigative reporters continue digging into the lobbying money trail. If this video helped you see the story differently, hit subscribe. I'm going to keep covering this as it develops, because this is one of those stories where the next chapter matters more than the last one, and I will see you in the next one.